Hi, this is Sarit Switzer, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast, a podcast devoted to the teachings of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi as recorded in his most famous work, the Tanya. My hope for this show is to make these teachings accessible and relatable to the average person, regardless of prior Jewish education or affiliation. The episodes follow the prescribed daily study portions and are meant to serve as practical lessons in how to live your life as your true self and develop an authentic and powerful relationship with your Creator. I have personally experienced the effects the study of this work has had on me, and I'm excited to share what I can of this knowledge with you. So please join me on this journey of learning, self-growth, and connection with your source. Hi, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast. This is episode 441 for the 15th of Shevat in a regular year. I'd like to begin today's episode by relating a fable that I happened to hear by Hashgacha Pratis very recently on some audiobook or podcast or something. I don't remember exactly where I heard it, but it's very telling, and it is very much in line of the theme of today. So the fable goes that one time there was a scorpion who asked a frog to carry him over a river. The frog hesitated and said, "I don't know if this is a good idea, because if I take you across the river, what's going to stop you from stinging me?" And the scorpion said, "Don't worry about that." He said, "If I were to sting you, then I would die, and then we'd both sink. So I don't want to drown. So, don't worry about that." And the frog says, "That's a really good point. Okay." And he says, "Sure. Okay, great. Come upon my back." So the scorpion goes onto the back of the frog, and they start swimming in the river, and everything's going great. Midway into the river, the scorpion stings the frog, and they start drowning. And as they're drowning, as they're about to die, the frog turns to the scorpion. He said, "Why did you do that?" And the scorpion says, "Alas, it is my nature." So why do I bring up this story? So the reason why I bring up this story is to illustrate the point that nature can be very cruel. Animals can behave very, very cruelly. There's a misconception, maybe promoted by Disney, I'm not sure, that, nature is really peaceful and beautiful. And if not for humanity, the humans are the ones that really come in and mess everything up. And if we were to just stay out of the way, everything would be glorious and amazing and everything. And the truth is that's not true. As we see, with this example with the scorpion, there are numerous other examples too of animals. Very many animals will kill for fun. Husky dogs are known to kill sheep for fun. Often there'll be like a farm of a bunch of dead sheep, and they were just killed by husky dogs. They weren't eaten. It wasn't for self-defense. It wasn't, for self-preservation or anything like that. It was just like raw killing for fun. A lot of animals will rape one another even. There are stories of ducks ganging up and raping hens. There are stories of chimps murdering. You often see cats toying and playing with mice, dragging them even after they died, just for fun. So the stories go on, and it really is quite horrific if you really think about it. But what we see from this story with the scorpion and the frog, that alas, this is their nature. This is the nature of animals. And when we say nature, people say, Mother Nature or whatever. As Jews, we believe, no, this is ultimately, it's Hashem. Who created their nature is Hashem. Hashem, God, is the one in charge of their nature, but this is how he created them. So the reason why I'm talking about this and how it's relevant to today's theme is we see that as cruel as animals can be, and as horrific as nature can be, at the end of the day, these animals do not have freedom of will, and they're behaving exactly in line with the way that God created them for whatever purpose. We don't know what that purpose is always. Often, usually, we don't know what the purpose is, but Hashem has his reasons. And we've talked about elsewhere in the Tanya how everything in the world, what is created and is vitalized by God. And for some reason or another, as we spoke about yesterday, there's even some things in the world that appear to be outright evil, that appear to go against the will of God, and their whole existence is like doing things that are against the will of God. But even these things as well are really only behaving in the way that God accorded to them. They're also being vitalized and sustained by God's will and wisdom, albeit in a backhanded manner. So now, where do humans fall in this whole scheme of things, or particularly Jews? We started speaking about this yesterday, and we're going to continue along these lines today, where we talk about the unique human capacity, and especially the unique Jewish capacity, to rise above nature, to act with free will, to not just be puppets, so to speak, at the hand of God. And just like, like the scorpion in the example, who just can't help it. This is their nature. We as Jews could help it. We don't need to just act in accordance with our nature. Our nature also, in fact, is quite complex, as we learned. We have an animal soul, we have a godly soul. There's a lot of factors at play there that really make us unique in that way. And just like how we spoke about yesterday, that a person who chooses the side of evil, when they have that choice, they actually degrade themselves below the evil forces, because the evil forces themselves don't have that choice. They're stuck in the darkness, whether they want to or not. So too are we going to learn today that if a person chooses to behave like an animal, they actually degrade themselves below the level of an animal, because as mentioned, animals can't help it. This is their nature. This is who they are. And whereas yesterday the focus was really on the fact that if a person does things that are against the will of God, they degrade themselves below the level of those things that are against the will of God, thus bringing themselves into the realm of evil. The angle that the Alter Rebbe is going to take today actually is on the fact that not only is a person like engaging with evil and degrading themselves when they engage in acts that are animalistic or, against the will of God, but it's actually insane. It's not a sane thing to do, to act in discord with the will of your creator. And we'll come to understand why that is. And so the Alter Rebbe begins this section for today. And for context, we're in the middle of chapter 24, where he actually brings a citation from the Gemara. And this is from Sota, page 3a. And this is, talking about the Sota, talking about the adulterous woman who, a woman that's married to a man, and then she commits adultery with somebody else, where the Gemara says, "En adam avera chule ela im ken nichnas beruach shtut." So a person does not commit a transgression unless a spirit of folly enters into him. So this is this idea that basically the only reason why somebody would go against the will of God, it's such a nonsensical thing to do. It's such a lowly thing to do that really is so beyond any kind of reason, that the only reason why somebody would actually go against the will of God is if a spirit of folly, of insanity enters into them. And the Alter Rebbe goes on and says, this applies, specifically the example is given with an adulterous woman. And why? Because in the case of an adulterous woman, the Alter Rebbe says, so this is like we're picturing a woman who actually might have certain lustful thoughts and is kind of frivolous in her mind. And even she, the Gemara is telling us, she would have been able to control her taivas, to control her desires, if not for the spirit of folly that was entered into her. So no matter how lustful a person is feeling, how frivolous they are, they wouldn't do something that would be against the will of God in such a manner, because it's so beyond the realm of sanity and it's so evil that it's not something somebody would do unless a spirit of folly entered into them. And this spirit of folly, what does it do? It conceals and covers up the hidden love that is found in the godly soul of this woman. So if you remember from previous episodes, we talked about this, that every single Jew contains within them a hidden love, which gets aroused in times of intense situations where somebody is threatened, God forbid, with death, or bow down to an idol or to renounce their Judaism or whatever. And time again, the Alter Rebbe told us how a Jew will be willing to give up their life rather than to renounce God. And so the Alter Rebbe is saying here that for this woman, she too has this hidden love of God within her. And this hidden love of God would prevent her from bowing down to idols if she were in such a state where it was like her life or bow down to an idol. And even if it was a state of just bow down and you don't actually have to believe in it within your heart, she wouldn't bow down to an idol, is what the Alter Rebbe is saying. And so if you think about this, that she would be willing to give up her life in order to not bow down to an idol, but yet she's not able to control her adulterous instincts, to her desires to be with another man. Like, it seems a little bit strange. And so the reason for this, the Alter Rebbe says, is because of the spirit of folly that enters into her. It's not a rational thing, because overcoming this momentary pleasure, this lust, that she has to cheat on her husband. I mean, okay, that might seem like a difficult thing to do, and maybe even you can say painful, but is it as painful as death? I don't think anybody would argue that it's more painful than death. Death is obviously more painful, but yet she'd be willing to give up her life for God if she was put in a situation of having to worship idols versus dying. And so if that's the case, she'd be willing to suffer the pain of death, but she's not willing to suffer the pain of overcoming this temptation of adultery. So it seems really strange, right? And so the Alter Rebbe explains that this is because it's not something rational. This is just because of the spirit of folly that is the klipa that becomes enclosed within her godly soul until the chokhmah that is within her. But not, the Alter Rebbe is makes sure to point out, not including the faculty of chokhmah. So it reaches up until her faculty of chokhmah, and so that is what causes her to commit adultery, is the spirit of folly. So what this means is basically the spirit of folly brings about this like certain temporary insanity to the adulterous woman, where she doesn't realize what she's doing, that she's going against the will of God, and isn't willing to sacrifice this temporary pleasure, even though she'd be very willing to sacrifice a whole life of pleasure by giving up her life and dying in order to not worship idols. But the truth is, get away from the insanity, the Alter Rebbe is saying, and let's look at it rationally. In true truth, even a very, very small transgression, this is going against the supernal will of God. And going against the supernal will of God, this is the utmost separation from his unity and from his oneness, even more than the sitra achra and the klipos, which are called other gods, and actual idolatry. And so too, in regards to all of the things that come out of the sitra achra and klipa in this world, what are those things? These are like the impure animals and beasts and impure birds and all the different insects and reptiles and things like that. And then the Alter Rebbe here brings a very apt saying from the Gemara, or citation from the Gemara from Sanhedrin, page 38a, where it says, Yatush kadmach, which literally means that the gnat, or like a mosquito, preceded you. So the Gemara is saying here basically that it's pointing out the fact that that a gnat was created before a human. So a human should not think of themselves as too high. We shouldn't get too high and mighty on ourselves. We should remember that we actually were the last creatures that were created. And hopefully this will give us a little bit of humility. And what the Alter Rebbe is pointing out here is that we are not, sort of what I was talking about in the beginning of the podcast today, is we are not greater than the animals in a certain sense. And when we go against the will of God, we're actually making ourselves a lot lower than them. And the reason why the Alter Rebbe picks the example of a gnat is, what is it about a gnat? It doesn't excrete. So it takes in and it doesn't give out. And this is an example of the lowest type of klipa, and the one that is the furthest from holiness, because it's like just taking, and it's not giving. Because what is holiness? Holiness is all about giving, and holiness is all about giving to that which is very far from it even. And so this gnat, which is like, the epitome of unholiness, that it just takes and doesn't give, this gnat is considered to be higher than, or it precedes the man who sins in the hishtalshalos, in like the descent of the vitality of the world from the supernal will of God. And this is true also for all the other impure animals, and even like the really bad and wild beasts. So, maybe in that category would fall some of the animals which I talked about in the beginning of this episode, which act in really, wild and horrendous, cruel way. So all of these animals, as wild and as evil as they might be, they do not deviate at all from God's command. And they are very aware of this, even if, let's say they're not consciously aware of it, but their spirit is aware of this. So they're very connected to God. all of these animals. And then the Alter Rebbe brings a couple of citations to support this point. The first one is from Bereshis, from Genesis chapter 9, verse 2, where it says, Morachem v'chitchem yeh al kol chayat haaretz, that the fear and dread of you shall lie upon every beast of the earth. So meaning to say that these animals have a spiritual sensitivity and they recognize God and they recognize our divine purpose in creation. And not only that, there's another citation here that the Alter Rebbe brings right after that, this time from the Gemara in Sanhedrin 38b, page 38b, where it says that there's no wild beast that will rule over an animal unless he sees this person as an animal. So meaning to say that animals inherently and instinctively recognize the superiority of man over them if that man is behaving like a man. But if a man behaves like an animal, then that goes away. And then the beast it makes the person vulnerable to attack by the beast. And then the Alter Rebbe says that tzaddikim, who the image of God never leaves their face ever, all of the most wildest animals can never rule over them. And the Alter Rebbe says that this is what's explained in the Zohar about Daniel, the prophet Daniel, who he was, amongst all the lions, and he wasn't attacked by the lions because he was such a great tzaddik. So tzaddikim have such a state of holiness that they really walk around with this presence of being human. And so animals know instinctively not to attack them, not to touch them. And so thus, the Alter Rebbe says that somebody who sins and goes against the will of God, even with a very small transgression, at the time that he's doing this transgression, God forbid, then he is at an utmost distance. He's very far from the supernal holiness, which is the unity and oneness of God, more than all the other animals, even the most impure animals and the insects and the reptiles that all come from the Sitra Achra and the Klipa and from idolatry. So that's the end of the section for today. And so just to kind of recap and bring it all together. So today is kind of a continuation from yesterday where we began talking about this topic about how it is that if a person does something that's against the will of God, it separates them like to the same degree basically as like when we do a mitzvah with God and it unifies us. Then if a person, God forbid, does something against the will of God, it separates them from God and it unifies them instead with the klipos and with the sitra achra, with these negative forces. And it not only does it unify them with these negative forces, but it actually degrades them below these negative forces, because as explained several times, these negative forces have no will of their own. They can't help that they're dark. This is how God created them. But a person can decide what they're going to do. So, and then again, the special angle that we took on this today was this idea of the insanity component and how it is that if a person does choose instead to go against the will of God, this is actually insane, because their inner being, like their inner truth, their inner deepest self is their godly soul, and they have this innate love of God that would cause them to give up their life. Like we've already spoken about how every Jew would be willing to give up their life for the sake of God. So it's like, so you'd be willing to give up your life for the sake of God, but you're not willing to forego the temporary pleasure that a certain sin brings. Like that's insane. That doesn't make sense. It's kind of like the equivalent of like if a person were to be offered really delicious chocolate cake, and it's amazing and delicious chocolate cake, but that chocolate cake is poisonous, would they eat the chocolate cake? If they would, that's insane. Like that's, it's like one thing to be like, to really like chocolate cake. It's another thing to be such a slave to your desires that you're willing to be poisoned, God forbid, for that. So that's sort of the way to think about sins, is in that sense, is that it might be a temporary type of pleasure, but it's really detrimental in terms of separating you from your creator, and that it really degrades you below the level of animals, of negative forces and other things like that can't help but be in that state to behave as they do. That's how God created them. That's their nature, as we explained with the story of the scorpion in the beginning. But you do have a choice. You do have agency. So that's the thing to keep in mind, is to try to live our lives as much in line with our true selves, with our creator, as we possibly can, to live a sane and connected existence. So that's the end of the section for today. And tomorrow we'll conclude this chapter. So stay Stick with it, and I'll speak to you then. Thanks for listening to the It Is Taught podcast, hosted by Sarit Switzer. This podcast is dedicated in loving memory of my maternal grandfather, Avraham Yitzchak ben Binyamin HaKohen of blessed memory. Music by Shoshana. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the show, please share it with others and subscribe on YouTube, Apple iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to leave us a 5-star review. To find out more about the It Is Taught project, including more information on my soon-to-be published book, please visit our website, itistaught.com. To catch the latest from me, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Looking forward to speaking with you tomorrow, and until then, have a great day.